The morning Homer Wells rode into Calico Flats, New Mexico territory. The year was 1883, and the dust followed him like it always had. Like it knew he belonged to no particular place, and had learned to accompany him simply because nothing else would. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same sandstone that formed the mesas surrounding the town. His eyes were the color of winter sky just before a storm, not quite blue, not quite gray, and they had a habit of settling on things with a patience that made most men uncomfortable and most women curious. He wore a battered brown hat, a canvas duster that had seen better years, and a Colt single-action Army revolver on his left hip that he had not drawn in anger in 11 months. That was a personal record, and he was quietly proud of it. He had come to Calico Flats because work had brought him, as work always did. Word had reached him 3 weeks prior, in a saloon in Santa Fe, that the Calico Flats Cattle Company was looking for a new ranch foreman. The previous foreman had up and disappeared one Tuesday morning, which the locals described with raised eyebrows and lowered voices, suggesting it was not so much a disappearance as a departure of the strongly encouraged variety. The ranch owner, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who was 60 and arthritic and not much for riding anymore, needed someone who could manage 62 hands, 800 head of cattle, and the kind of rugged terrain that ate lesser men for breakfast. Homer Wells was not a lesser man. He pulled his horse, a sorrel gelding he called Amos, one of the few living things he had bothered to name in the past decade, to a stop outside the Gold Dust Saloon, and dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who had spent more hours in the saddle than out of it. He tied Amos to the hitching post, patted the horse's neck once, and walked inside. The saloon smelled of sawdust, tobacco, and whiskey that had been watered down enough to pass as something it was not. 3 men sat at a card table near the window. A bartender with arms like fence posts polished a glass with a rag that was somehow making it dirtier. And behind the bartender, pinned to the wall with a single nail, was a piece of paper that read, Land Surveyor, Margaret Archer, Office, Main Street, second door past the assay office. No appointment necessary. Homer read it once, registered it with the same flat attention he gave to everything, and ordered a whiskey. "You passing through?" the bartender asked. "No," Homer said. The bartender waited, in the way bartenders do, as if the silence itself was an invitation to elaborate. Homer drank his whiskey and set the glass down on the bar with measured precision and did not elaborate. The bartender moved on to the next customer. Homer was used to this. He had been closing conversation since he was 22 years old, which was the year his mother died, and the year the woman he had intended to marry chose a merchant in Albuquerque over a cowboy with uncertain prospects, and the year Homer Wells had quietly, methodically, and with great thoroughness, decided that needing people was a luxury he could not afford. It had served him well, this decision. For 10 years it had served him exceptionally well. He finished his whiskey, left a fair coin on the bar, and went to find Gerald Hutchins. Hutchins was an easy man to find because he spent every morning at the same table in the Calico Flats diner, eating eggs and reading whatever newspaper was 3 days old, which was the freshest you could get this far from anywhere. He was exactly as advertised, 60, arthritic, with the leathered face of a man who had built something hard in a hard country, and had the good sense now to let someone else maintain it. "Homer Wells," Homer said, pulling out the chair across from Hutchins without being invited to sit, because men who spent 10 years needing nobody also tended to skip social preliminaries. Hutchins looked up from his newspaper. He studied Homer with the calculating eye of a man who had hired enough people to know the ones who would last from the ones who would not. Whatever he saw in Homer Wells apparently passed inspection. "Heard about you in Santa Fe," Hutchins said. "Heard you ran the double-cross operation for 4 years without losing a single head to rustlers." "Losing cattle to rustlers is mostly a failure of attention," Homer said. "I pay attention." Hutchins smiled, which deepened the lines around his mouth into something resembling canyon walls. "You'll do," he said. "Be at the ranch at first light tomorrow. Colby will show you the operation." Homer nodded, rose, and left. That was the entirety of his interview. Later, he would reflect that the whole exchange took 4 minutes, and that it had satisfied him completely, 2 men arriving at a practical understanding without the mess of unnecessary sentiment. He went to find a room at the boarding house, which was run by a widow named Mrs. Patel, which surprised him, because he had not expected to find a woman of Indian descent running a boarding house in New Mexico territory. She looked at him with clear, direct eyes and said, "$6 a week, meals included. I do not tolerate drunkenness, fighting, or guests who do not wipe their boots." He paid her for 2 weeks in advance, wiped his boots on the mat outside the door, and found his room acceptable. That evening, eating supper in Mrs. Patel's dining room alongside 2 miners and a traveling salesman, Homer heard the name Margaret Archer for the 2nd time that day. "She is going to be trouble for Hutchins," one of the miners was saying. His name was Tom Eves, and he had a beard that had clearly won a prolonged battle against any attempts at grooming. "Mark my words. She has been out there 3 times this week with her equipment, surveying that eastern parcel." "Who has?" Homer asked, because this was directly relevant to the job he was starting tomorrow. Tom Eves looked at him like he had just materialized out of thin air. "Margaret Archer, the land surveyor, been here about 6 months. Came down from Colorado, they say. Did a full survey of the Hennessy claim up in Taos before that. She knows her business, I will give her that. But she has been commissioned by the Territorial Land Office to resurvey the eastern boundary of Hutchins's land, and from what I hear, the preliminary marks suggest Hutchins has been grazing on public land for about 12 years without paying so much as a nickel for the privilege." "That is not Hutchins's problem," the other miner, a quiet man named Flores, said. "That is the problem of whoever sold him the claim with the wrong boundaries." "Try telling that to the Territorial Land Office," Tom Eves said. Homer ate the rest of his supper without comment, but he filed the information away with the same careful diligence he applied to everything. A land survey dispute. In his experience, land survey disputes were one of the top 3 causes of violence in the New Mexico territory, sitting comfortably alongside water rights and cattle theft. He made a mental note to speak with Mr. Hutchins about it in the morning. He did not make any mental note regarding Margaret Archer herself. He would later consider this a significant oversight. He met her the following afternoon. He had spent the morning learning the ranch, walking the operation with Colby, the outgoing assistant foreman who was so relieved to be delegating responsibility that he practically ran beside Homer, pointing at things with both hands. The ranch was well constructed and moderately well run, which meant there was meaningful room for improvement. Homer identified 7 immediate problems and 9 medium-term ones, and did not share this list with Colby because the man was already sweating through his shirt just from the anxiety of the morning. In the early afternoon, Homer rode the eastern fence line on Amos, doing what he did best, which was paying attention. The land out here was beautiful in the ruthless way that country was beautiful when it didn't care whether you found it so or not: red rock formations rising from yellow grass, the occasional cottonwood along a dry creek bed, the sky an enormous and unforgiving blue overhead. He found her at the eastern marker, which was a weathered wooden post half buried in the hard ground. She had a transit level set up on a tripod, and was looking through the eyepiece with the focused concentration of someone who has temporarily forgotten that the rest of the world exists. Beside her, resting against the tripod's leg, was a rifle, a Winchester Model 1873, that told Homer she was not naive about the practicalities of being alone in this country. He pulled Amos to a stop about 20 feet away and sat in his saddle and watched her work for a moment, not from any particular interest in her as a person, but because moving suddenly around someone with a rifle nearby was unwise. She straightened up from the eyepiece without turning around. The Hutchins hand who has been watching me for the past 2 minutes can either state his business or go back the way he came, she said, in a voice that was perfectly even and carried no visible indication that having a stranger on a horse behind her caused her any particular concern. Homer adjusted his opinion of her upward by several degrees. "Homer Wells," he said, "new foreman. Mr. Hutchins asked me to ride the fence line." She turned around then, and Homer Wells, who had spent 10 years making a careful science of not being affected by anything or anyone, had one single disorienting moment of something that he immediately and firmly refused to identify. She was perhaps 29 or 30, with dark auburn hair pulled back under a practical wide-brimmed hat, and eyes that were such a direct and unsparing shade of dark brown that they looked like they were doing their own quiet survey of whatever they rested on. Her face was tanned from months of field work, with faint lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting through lenses in bright sunlight, and her expression was one that he recognized with an uncomfortable clarity, because it was fundamentally his own expression reflected back at him. The expression of someone who had arrived at a position of self-sufficiency and found it satisfactory, and was not interested in having that position challenged. "Margaret Archer," she said. "Land surveyor, commissioned by the Territorial Land Office. I have documentation if you want to see it." "That won't be necessary," Homer said. "Most of Hutchins's men would have made me produce it." "I know who you are," Homer said. "You have every right to be here if the commission is legitimate, and if the Territorial Land Office commissioned it, it's legitimate." She studied him with those brown eyes for a moment. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect? Someone trying to run me off?" "Not my job," Homer said simply. "My job is cattle. The boundary dispute is a legal matter." She gave a short nod that acknowledged this as a reasonable and accurate statement. "Then I will not take up any more of your time, Mr. Wells." "How long will you be out here?" he asked, and then was mildly surprised that he had asked, because it was not strictly his business. "Another week on this parcel, maybe 2. There is a water source about a mile northeast of here along the dry creek. It runs in the morning. If you are working these eastern sections, you should know about it." She looked at him again with that measuring look. "Thank you," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested genuine surprise not at the information itself, but at the fact that it had been offered at all. Homer tipped his hat, turned Amos around, and rode back toward the ranch house. Behind him, he heard the sound of her transit level being adjusted, and knew she had returned to her work before he was even 50 feet away. 2 people, in other words, who had no interest in lingering. He thought about that, riding back. He thought about it more than was warranted. Over the following week, the patterns of their work brought them into regular proximity. This was unavoidable, given that the eastern fence line was one of Homer's primary concerns, and the eastern parcel was where Margaret spent most of her working hours. They developed an unspoken arrangement that satisfied both of them in its functionality. She worked, he worked. They occasionally passed within speaking distance, and when they did, information was exchanged briefly and practically, and then they returned to their respective occupations. She told him on the second day that her preliminary measurements suggested the eastern fence was approximately a quarter-mile inside the actual legal boundary, which meant Hutchins had been grazing roughly 200 additional acres of territorial land. He told her, on the third day, that the water situation at the eastern spring was deteriorating because the mouth was getting clogged with debris from the last hard rain, and that she should boil the water before drinking it until it cleared. On the 4th day, they had their first genuine conversation, which happened because a late-season thunderstorm came off the mountains with the kind of speed and fury that this part of the territory could produce without warning, and they both found themselves sheltering under the same overhang of red rock with their horses because there was nowhere else to go. The rain came down in gray curtains and thunder rattled the rock walls, and Margaret Archer sat with her back against the stone and pulled her hat down and said, without looking at him, "How long have you been in this business?" "Ranch work, Since I was 16. No permanent place. No. She was quiet for a moment, watching the rain. I've been surveying for 7 years, she said. Started as a rod woman for a survey crew in Colorado. The surveyor thought it was amusing to have a woman holding the rod. Turned out I was better at the calculations than he was, which he found considerably less amusing. Homer almost smiled. He controlled it. How did you end up with your own commission? A surveyor in Denver named Ellison got sick and needed someone to finish his Taos contract. I finished it and they filed it under my name. After that I had a record. And before surveying, she looked at him then, with a directness that he found he could not deflect as easily as he deflected most things. Before surveying I was married, she said, with the flat, unadorned delivery of someone who had made peace with a fact by reducing it to its essential structure. My husband died of typhoid fever in 1876. We had a daughter. She died 6 days after him. Homer said nothing for a moment because there was nothing to say that would not be insufficient, and insufficient responses were something he actively avoided. I am sorry, he said finally. And because he was not a man who trafficked in hollow platitudes, he left it at exactly that. She nodded once, accepting it. It was 7 years ago, she said. I am not asking for condolences. I mention it only because it answers your question about how I came to be doing what I do. When you have nothing left to lose and nowhere in particular to be, you can go where the work takes you. Homer looked at the rain. I know something about that, he said. I imagine you do, she said. They sat in companionable silence for another 30 minutes while the storm ran its course, and Homer Wells was disturbed to discover that the silence did not feel like what silence usually felt like to him. It usually felt like a perimeter, something he maintained around himself. This silence felt different. It felt like two people who had both independently arrived at the same position and were now, unexpectedly, in each other's company. He did not like how comfortable it was. He did not like it because comfortable things had a way of becoming necessary things, and he had spent a considerable portion of his adult life ensuring that nothing became necessary. When the rain stopped, she went back to her transit and he went back to his fence line, and they did not look at each other as they went their separate ways, which was a thing that people who are pretending not to be affected by something tend to do. That evening, back at Mrs. Patel's boarding house, Homer sat on the small porch outside his room and looked at the darkening sky and thought, with genuine exasperation at himself, that Margaret Archer was one of the most self-possessed people he had encountered in a decade, that she had built her life on exactly the same principles he had built his own, that she asked nothing of anyone and expected nothing from anyone, and moved through the world with a quiet competence that required no external validation. He recognized this because it was precisely what he had trained himself to be, and it was, he noted with deep suspicion, absolutely undoing him. He could not have explained it. He had been around plenty of capable, independent women in his years of traveling. He had been around women who wanted nothing from him, and women who wanted everything from him, and women who occupied the complicated middle ground between those positions. None of them had made him feel whatever this particular feeling was, which he was provisionally identifying as a kind of alarmed recognition, the feeling of looking in a mirror and seeing something in your own reflection that you had not expected to find there. He went to bed early and slept badly and was at the ranch by first light the next morning, which he attributed entirely to professional diligence. On the 5th day, one of Hutchins's hands, a young, mean-mouthed fellow named Bert Caldwell, who had been on the ranch for 2 years, and had apparently spent those 2 years developing the professional opinion that women had no business doing survey work, rode out to the eastern fence and began making comments in Margaret's direction that were not, in any technical sense, physically threatening, but were of a character that Homer Wells found, upon hearing them from 50 yards away, deeply unacceptable. He rode over at an unhurried pace that nevertheless covered the distance quickly. Margaret, for her part, had not moved from her transit and had not looked up from her eyepiece. She said, in a voice that was absolutely level, "I have taken note of your objections, and they are irrelevant to the commission I am authorized to execute." Bert Caldwell said something that Homer did not need to hear twice. Homer pulled Amos alongside Caldwell's horse and said, in a quiet voice, "Ride back to the north pasture and stay there until I say otherwise." Caldwell turned to look at him with the specific expression of a man who is deciding whether the person giving him an instruction is someone he can disregard. He read Homer's face for about 2 seconds and apparently concluded that disregarding was not an option. He spat in the dirt, which was the closest he could come to protest without actual protest, and rode away. Homer looked at Margaret. She had finally lifted her eye from the transit eyepiece and was watching him with that measuring expression. "That was not necessary," she said. "I was managing." "I know you were," he said. "That is not why I did it." "Why did you do it then?" "Because it is my crew, and that is not how they behave on my watch. It reflects on the operation." She looked at him for a moment longer than she needed to if she was simply accepting his explanation. "All right," she said. "Will you be out here tomorrow?" He asked, and again was mildly irritated at himself for the question. "I will be out here until the survey is complete," she said. "Of course," he said, and rode on, and told himself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. On the 6th day he brought an extra canteen when he rode the eastern fence line. When he came within range of where she was working, he left it on the fence post nearest to her position and rode on without stopping. 2 hours later, riding back, the canteen was empty and had been left on the same post with a clean handkerchief folded beneath it. He looked at the handkerchief for a moment and put it in his coat pocket and rode on. That evening he found her at the assay office, which shared the same block as her survey office, trying to talk the assay clerk into lending her a mule because her own horse had thrown a shoe, and the farrier was not expected until the following day. The clerk, a small nervous man named Purvis, was explaining with great regret that the mule was actually currently being used. Homer, who was at the assay office for reasons entirely related to determining mineral compositions of soil samples from the north pasture, because he was thorough about these things, said without particular forethought, "I have a spare horse at the Hutchins stable. Steady animal. You can use him tomorrow if you need to get to the eastern parcel." Margaret turned to look at him with the expression she had been giving him with increasing frequency, which was the expression of someone revising a calculation they thought they had already finished. "That is very generous," she said. It came out with a slight hesitation, as though generosity was something she encountered infrequently enough to require a brief recalibration. "Practical," he said. "The survey needs to be completed accurately. Inaccurate surveys cause trouble. I have enough trouble managing the ranch without additional complications from an incomplete land record." The excuse satisfied neither of them, but both of them accepted it in the interest of maintaining the agreeable fiction that they were two purely practical people engaged in a purely practical exchange. 6 o'clock, she said. 6 o'clock, he said. He was at the stable at 5:40, which he attributed to professional punctuality. She was there at 5:50, which meant she was also 10 minutes early, and they both registered this simultaneously, and neither of them said anything about it, which was the loudest conversation they had yet had. He showed her the horse, a steady bay gelding named, with a complete lack of imagination, bay, and showed her the saddle and tack. She was competent with horses in the way people are when they have been working in the field for years and cannot afford to be otherwise. She checked the cinch herself, checked the bit, adjusted the stirrup length with confident hands. Homer watched this and was struck again by that quality she had of self-contained capability that was both entirely admirable and entirely maddening. "I can return him by the time evening chores start," she said. "No hurry," he said. She gave him another one of those recalculating looks. "Mr. Wells," she said, and paused, and then continued with the careful precision of someone choosing each word with deliberate intention. "I appreciate the help. I'm not good at asking for help." "Neither am I," he said. There was a long moment of the New Mexico Territory morning hanging around them both, the smell of horses and dry grass and the coming day. And then she mounted bay and rode out toward the eastern parcel, and Homer stood in the entrance of the stable and watched her go until she was a small shape against the red dawn, and then he stood there a little longer than that, staring at the empty distance. Amos bumped him in the shoulder from behind his stall door, which was Amos's way of commenting on the situation. "I know," Homer said to the horse. "I know." He did not know precisely what he knew. But he knew something, and that was already more than he was accustomed to knowing in this particular category of experience. The survey was completed at the end of the second week, and the final measurements confirmed what the preliminary data had suggested. The Hutchins eastern fence was 237 acres inside the actual legal boundary of his land grant. The additional acreage was classified as territorial grazing land, and the Territorial Land Office would be requiring Hutchins to either purchase the acreage at fair market value or relocate his fence. Margaret filed her report on a Thursday morning. Homer heard about it from Hutchins himself, who called him into the main house that afternoon looking less like a man receiving unexpected news and more like a man receiving news he had been quietly anticipating for some time. "She did her job," Hutchins said, with the grudging respect that one practical person gives another. "The measurements are sound. Ellison in Santa Fe verified her methodology. I cannot dispute them." "What will you do?" Homer asked. "Purchase the acreage," Hutchins said. "It's good grazing land. I should have filed on it properly years ago." He paused. "That Archer woman, she do solid work." "Best I've seen," Homer said, and meant it without qualification. Hutchins nodded. "Tell her she is welcome to survey the northern boundary when the spring commission comes through. Might as well do it right while we're at it." Homer went to find Margaret. Her office on Main Street was a single room with a large drafting table, several sets of wooden drawers for her instruments, a bookshelf with surveying manuals and territorial maps, and a single window looking out onto the street. When he pushed the door open, she was at the drafting table, working on what appeared to be a different set of maps, not the Hutchins Commission, something new. She was completely absorbed in the work, her dark auburn hair loose around her shoulders because she was inside and had removed her field hat, and she had a pencil tucked behind one ear and another in her hand, and she was making precise, careful notations with the focused attention of someone for whom precision was not a professional standard, but a personal principle. Homer stood in the doorway for a moment, aware that she had not heard him come in, aware that he should announce himself, and also aware that he was not moving. He was doing what he had noticed himself doing more frequently in the past 2 weeks, which was simply looking at Margaret Archer and thinking that every other person he had ever met had always eventually revealed the place where they were hollow or pretending. He kept looking for that place in her, and he kept not finding it, and this was doing something to him that he did not have adequate language for. She looked up. For a moment she simply looked at him, and he thought he saw something in her expression that went through several rapid and silent adjustments: surprise, recognition, and then that characteristic composure that closed over everything the way still water closed over a stone. "Mr. Hutchins sent you," she said. "He wants to know if you would be available for the northern boundary survey when the spring commission comes through," Homer said. "I would be available," she said. Homer stood in the doorway and did not leave, which was behavior he could not fully account for. "There is a dinner at the hotel on Saturday," he said, and then stopped because he was not entirely sure how he had intended to finish that sentence, which was unprecedented in his experience. Homer Wells did not start sentences without knowing their conclusions. She watched him with those dark eyes. "Gerald Hutchins is hosting a dinner for the Calico Flats Land Association," he finished, which was accurate but was also, he recognized with some discomfort, not the real reason he had started the sentence. "As foreman of the operation, I am obligated to attend, and since the survey work will likely be a significant item of discussion—" "Are you asking me to the dinner, Mr. Wells?" she said. She was not teasing. She was asking the question with the same direct economy with which she asked every question, and it cut right through the professional scaffolding he had been attempting to construct around the invitation. He was 32 years old. He had spent 10 years proving he needed nobody. He stood in the doorway of a land surveyor's office in Calico Flats, New Mexico territory, and felt something he had actively worked for a decade to prevent. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He watched something move through her eyes that was not quite caution and not quite hope, but was something in the difficult country between those two territories. "I should tell you something," she said. "I did not come to Calico Flats looking for anything other than work. I have made a life that works for me, a quiet life, an orderly life." "So have I," he said, "and I am not interested in complications." "Neither am I," he said. She studied him. "And yet here you are," she said. "Here I am," he agreed. Another moment, long and weighted with the particular quality of two people standing at the edge of something they have both spent considerable time avoiding. "Saturday dinner," she said. "I will meet you at the hotel at 7. He nodded once, tipped his hat, and left. He walked back to the boarding house in the early October evening, with the yellow light coming down through the cottonwood trees, and he thought that he felt something he had not felt in 10 years, which was the entirely unwelcome and entirely unmistakable sensation of caring what happened next. Saturday came with a clear, cold sky and the smell of approaching autumn, which in New Mexico territory came with a sharpness to the air and a quality of light that made everything look like it had just been cleaned. Homer wore his best shirt, which was dark blue and relatively new, and his good hat, and polished his boots, and looked at himself in the small mirror in his room at Mrs. Patel's boarding house and felt a complete fool, which he recognized as a sign that things were more serious than he had been pretending they were. He was at the hotel at 6:45. She was there at 6:50. She had done something with her hair. It was still practical, still herself, but there was a softness to it that the field hat usually concealed, and she wore a dark green dress that he suspected she had packed for exactly these kinds of occasions and probably rarely used. She looked like herself, only with the slightly different quality of a person who has allowed themselves one evening off from their ordinary competent armor. He thought she was the most striking woman he had ever seen in his entire life, and he told none of that to his face. "Mr. Wells," she said. "Miss Archer," he said, and offered his arm because the social occasion warranted it, and she took it with the slight stiffness of someone who is not accustomed to the gesture and is recalibrating in real time. The dinner was held in the hotel's main room, a larger space than the saloon next door, with 4 long tables and lanterns hung from the rafters, and about 30 people who represented the major land interests in the area. Gerald Hutchins sat at the head of the central table and nodded at Homer with the approving expression of a man who has correctly assessed a hiring decision. He looked at Margaret with the more complex expression of a man who respects someone who has cost him money. "Miss Archer," Hutchins said, "good survey work." "Thank you, Mr. Hutchins," Margaret said, without elaborating, which Hutchins apparently found appropriate. They sat together and ate a dinner of roasted beef and potatoes and corn that had been prepared by the hotel cook with evident effort, and the conversation around the table was the large practical conversation of people whose lives revolved around land and cattle and water, and the daily negotiation with a territory that was beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. Homer was not much for dinner conversation in the general case, but he found that talking to Margaret at table was different from talking to most people, because she paid genuine attention and said substantive things, and did not fill silences with noise simply to avoid the silence. At one point, she made an observation about the territorial water rights legislation that made 2 of the men across the table stop eating and look at her with revised expressions, because it was exactly the kind of incisive comment that only someone who had actually thought carefully about the subject could make. "That is a sharp point," one of the men, a rancher named Delgado who ran a sizable operation to the south, said. "It is a correct point," Margaret said, which was not boasting, just precision. After dinner, people drifted onto the hotel's porch and the surrounding street, and Homer found himself walking alongside Margaret in the cool October evening, and they walked to the end of Main Street and back without having planned to. And the conversation moved from water rights to the stars overhead, which were extraordinary out here, away from the lamplight of town, bright and numerous, and making the sky feel both vast and close. "Do you know the constellations?" she asked, looking up. "Some," he said. "Enough to navigate you." "All of them," she said. "I had to learn them. Field surveying at night requires celestial reference points." She tilted her head back and moved her arm in a gesture that traced a path across the sky. "Right now you can see Cassiopeia and Pegasus, and if you look there," she moved closer to him to direct his line of sight along her outstretched arm, "that is Andromeda." He looked along the line of her arm at the stars, and was significantly less interested in the stars than in the fact that she was close enough that he could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair, and that she was completely unself-conscious about the proximity because she was engaged in explaining something with the earnestness that came over her when she was talking about work she loved. And he thought that this exact quality of earnest engagement that she tried to contain within professional edges and couldn't quite manage, was the thing he had been most trying not to be affected by, and was most spectacularly failing to resist. She finished explaining Andromeda and turned her face and found his eyes already on her. A moment. "Homer," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and the single word seemed to open something in the air between them. "Margaret," he said. Another moment longer in which both of them stood in the cold New Mexico night, and neither of them retreated the way they would have retreated from anyone else. And this, Homer thought, was the real event. Not the dinner, not the conversation, not even the nearness of her. The real event was the moment when two people who had built their entire lives on the principle of not needing each other looked at each other and knew, with the same certainty with which a survey measurement is confirmed through a second independent calculation, that the principle had failed. She looked away first, which surprised him, because she was not a woman who looked away from things. "I think we should be honest with each other," she said, to the dark beyond the edge of town. "I am always honest," he said. "Then honestly, this is not something I planned for." "No," he said, "and I am not sure what to do with it." "Neither am I," he said. "But I find I am less bothered by that than I expected to be." She turned back to look at him, and there, it was that thing in her eyes that she had been keeping behind the professional composure, something that was genuine and a little afraid, and also fundamentally unwilling to pretend it wasn't there. He had never been the man who said the right thing in these moments. He had, historically, said nothing at all in these moments, which is how he had arrived at 32 in his current condition. But Margaret Archer was not a woman who required flowery speeches, and she was not a woman who needed to be pursued. What she needed, what, watching her, he thought she had needed for a long time and refused to admit, was simply someone who would show up. Someone whose presence was genuine and whose word was reliable and whose idea of caring for someone was showing up again the next day and the day after that, without drama and without pretension. He could do that he could do. "Walk with me tomorrow," he said. "There is a place on the western edge of the property, Red Rock Canyon, worth seeing." She was quiet for a moment. "In the morning, after 10, the light is better." "All right," she said. They walked back to the hotel porch, and he said good night, and she said good night, and they went their separate directions. And Homer Wells walked back to Mrs. Patel's boarding house in the dark with the stars overhead, and felt that the sky was enormous, and that things were in motion that he had spent a long time keeping still. He slept well for the first time in 2 weeks. The morning ride to the Western Canyon was everything the evening had promised and more. The light on the red rock formations was extraordinary, deep orange and gold in the late morning sun, the shadows dramatic, and the colors alive in a way that made the country feel like something between a painting and a dream. They rode side by side on Amos and the bay horse, and genuinely talked, in the way that two people who have both been starved for genuine conversation without knowing it will sometimes fall into without warning. She told him about Colorado, about the survey crew, about the long days in the field, and the satisfaction of producing a record that was accurate and lasting. She told him about Ellison in Denver, the old surveyor who had given her her first real commission, and how he had died the following year and left her his transit level, which was the one she still used, and which she considered the most valuable thing she owned. He told her about the Double Cross Ranch in Texas, about the 4 years managing that operation, about the cattle drive of 1879 that had covered 700 miles and taken 3 months, and was both the hardest and most satisfying thing he had ever done professionally. He told her about the ranch in Arizona before that, and the one in New Mexico before that, and the long series of practical choices that had moved him across the Southwest like a useful tool being applied wherever the need was greatest. "Do you miss having a home?" she asked. They had stopped at the rim of the canyon, and below them the red rock dropped away in dramatic shelves toward a narrow floor where a line of cottonwoods marked a stream. "I don't know," he said, and meant it. "I have not had one long enough to know what I'm missing." "I had one," she said. "In Denver, Thomas and I had a house on Larimer Street, small, white fence. He planted a vegetable garden in the back." She paused. "After he died, I sold it and went to stay with his sister for 3 months and then took the first survey commission that was offered to me. I have been moving since." "Does it help?" he asked. "The moving?" She thought about this with the seriousness she gave everything. "At first it did," she said. "It replaced one kind of emptiness with industry. After a while it just became what I do. I am good at the work is enough." "Is it?" he said, not challenging her, asking. She looked at the canyon below them for a long time. "I thought it was," she said quietly. He said nothing. Below them, the cottonwood leaves trembled in the canyon wind, and the sound of the stream was faint but present, and the territory extended away from them in all directions in its great ancient patience. "What about you?" she said, turning to look at him. "My mother died when I was 22, he said, which was not something he said to people, and the fact of its saying registered on his own face as a slight tightening around the eyes that he didn't bother to conceal. "She was the last person I had. After that I made a decision." He looked out at the canyon. "That needing people was a cost I couldn't afford." "And was it?" she said. "Affordable, I mean, not needing anyone." He thought about the 10 years, the long succession of ranches, the excellent professional reputation, the complete adequacy of his practical life, and the long, careful evenings alone with nothing but the satisfaction of work well done. "It was manageable," he said. "It was clean, nothing could hurt you." "No," she said, "nothing could hurt you." She paused. "Nothing could do much of anything, though." He looked at her. She was looking at the canyon, her profile clean against the sky. "No," he said, "nothing much." They rode back to town in the early afternoon, and he helped her dismount at the stable with a hand that she briefly held a moment longer than necessary. And they stood in the stable yard in the warm October sun, and she looked up at him with those dark, direct eyes, and he looked down at her, and the thing between them was no longer something that could be reduced to professional proximity or practical convenience or the sociable accident of working near each other. "I do not want to rush this," she said. "I don't rush things," he said, which was true in every other area of his life and which he hoped would remain true here, though he was not fully confident. "I know you don't," she said. "I watched you work for 2 weeks. You are the most methodical man I have ever encountered. And you are the most thorough woman," he said. A beat. And then she laughed, which was something he had not heard from her before, a real laugh, low and genuine, that came from somewhere unguarded and lit her whole face. And Homer Wells felt the remaining structure of his 10-year position collapse with a quiet internal sound like a fence post finally giving way to the weight it has held against for too long. "Let me take you to supper on Wednesday," he said. "Yes," she said simply. October became November in the New Mexico territory with a gradual chill, and the first morning frosts on the grass, and the cattle moving closer to the water sources. Homer managed the ranch with the same thorough attention he brought to everything, and the operation improved measurably under his management in ways that Hutchins noted and appreciated without making a great deal of noise about, because Hutchins was also a practical man who expressed satisfaction through continued employment rather than verbal praise. But the central fact of Homer's November was Margaret Archer. Wednesday suppers became Friday walks. Friday walks became Sunday afternoons at her office, where he would bring coffee from the hotel, and she would spread her current work across the drafting table and explain it to him. And he would ask questions that were not pretending to be interested but actually were, because the precision and intellectual rigor of land surveying turned out to be something he genuinely found compelling, possibly because it was a discipline built on exactness and evidence, and the stubborn insistence on getting things right. She came to the ranch twice, and he showed her the full operation with a thoroughness that surprised him, because he was not in the habit of showing people things. She asked excellent questions about the cattle and the grazing patterns and the relationship between the land and the water, and he answered them with the same quality of genuine engagement she gave everything. And at some point during the second visit, standing at the fence of the western pasture watching the cattle move in the late afternoon light, she had taken his hand. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. Simply reached over and taken his hand in hers, and he had stood very still for a moment, as though the gesture might startle if he moved too quickly, and then held her hand back with an intentionality that said everything he had not yet said directly. They stood there until the sun went below the mesa, and then walked back to the horses in the gathering dark, and he held her hand until they reached the horses and then helped her up and rode back to town alongside her, in the quiet satisfaction of people who have arrived somewhere they did not expect to arrive and find it better than anything they had planned. He kissed her for the first time in the first week of November, on the porch of her survey office in the blue dusk, after they had argued good-naturedly for 40 minutes about the best method for establishing a baseline measurement in rocky terrain, she maintaining that the three-point method gave cleaner results, he arguing that the two-point method with a correction factor was more practical in the field. He had been proving a point about triangulation with a piece of charcoal on the back of a map, and she had been listening with her arms crossed, and that expression she got when she disagreed with something, but was genuinely evaluating the argument before saying so, and he had looked up from the map and found her eyes on him, and the argument about triangulation had dissolved entirely. He kissed her and she kissed him back, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then she put her forehead briefly against his shoulder in a gesture that was so small and so uncharacteristically undefended that it made something ache in him. "I did not plan this," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I am not sure I know how to do this anymore," she said. "I have not." She paused. "It has been a long time." "For me too," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him with an expression that was honest and a little frightened and also fundamental, in the way that things are when they have been true for longer than you have been willing to admit them. "Tell me you are not going to be gone in 6 months," she said. This was not a small request. This was, for a man who had spent 10 years moving from place to place and giving nothing roots, a very large request indeed. He understood exactly what it cost her to ask it. "Hutchins has offered me a permanent foreman position," Homer said. "Have not answered him yet." "What are you waiting for?" she said. "I was waiting," he said slowly, "to have a reason that was bigger than the work." She looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw the same calculation she had been running for the past 2 months, the careful, methodical assessment of evidence and probability that was the fundamental architecture of her mind, applied now to the hardest question of all, whether to trust this, whether to let this be real. "Tell him yes," she said. He told Hutchins yes the following morning. That winter was the best of Homer Wells's adult life, which was a thing he would not have predicted with any confidence as recently as September. It was not a dramatic or spectacular kind of best. There were no extraordinary events, no dramatic revelations. It was best in the same way that a well-built structure is best: solid, reliable, built on good materials and put together by someone who knew what they were doing. He and Margaret settled into each other with the quiet determination of two people who have both been self-sufficient long enough to understand that choosing someone is a different thing entirely from needing them. They were not a couple who leaned. They were a couple who stood side by side and faced the same direction, and this, Homer found, was a far more satisfying arrangement than anything he had imagined love to be. There were difficulties, as there are always difficulties. Margaret had spent 7 years in the habit of making every decision alone, and did not always remember that she had someone to consult, and Homer had spent 10 years in the habit of considering only himself, and sometimes failed to account for the fact that his choices now had implications for someone else. These were not dramatic failures. They were the ordinary frictions of two independent people learning the grammar of partnership, and they worked through them with the same directness they brought to everything, because neither of them had any patience for evasion. In December, Homer drove Margaret in a borrowed wagon to Santa Fe to file her Northern Boundary Commission paperwork with the Territorial Land Office, which was an administrative necessity that turned into the first time they had spent more than a single day together in the same company. 2 days traveling, 2 days in Santa Fe, 2 days back. They stayed at a respectable hotel in separate rooms because Margaret was a woman who cared about her professional reputation in a territory where professional reputation was a woman, surveyor's most essential asset. He respected this without reservation. They spent the evenings in the hotel's public sitting room, talking, and he was struck again and again by the quality of her mind, by the range of her reading, by the precision of her thinking, by the way she would sit with a question for a long time before answering it, because she considered a thoughtless answer worse than no answer at all. On the last evening in Santa Fe, sitting by the fire in the hotel sitting room while the December wind came off the mountains and made the windows rattle in their frames, she said, "I have been thinking about what I want." He waited. "I would like to continue surveying," she said. "I would not be happy without the work. I want you to know that about me." "I know that about you," he said. "A life entirely domesticated," she paused. "That would not be right for me." "I'm not asking for that," he said. "I would not know what to do with a domesticated Margaret Archer. I'm not sure she would exist." A small smile. "What are you asking for?" "I haven't asked yet," he said. She looked at him. "But I intend to," he said, "when we get back to Calico Flats." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "I have not been entirely sure I was capable of this again," she said softly. "Nor have I," he said. "And yet here we are," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that echoed the thing she had said to him in her office doorway months ago, and it was warmer now, full of a different kind of acknowledgement. He reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his. "Here we are," he said. He proposed on a cold January morning, standing at the eastern fence line where they had first met, with Amos tied to the fence post, and the whole red and golden country spread out around them in the winter light. It was not an elaborate proposal. He had a ring, simple, gold, with a small garnet because he had noticed she sometimes wore a garnet brooch at her collar, that he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe during the December trip, carried in his coat pocket for 3 weeks, and now held out to her with both hands, the way you would offer something you understood to be valuable. "Margaret Archer," he said, "I have spent 10 years proving to myself that I needed nobody. I was good at it. I do not intend to give it up entirely because I think the independence we both have is the reason this works, but I want to need you. I am choosing to need you, and I am asking if you will choose to need me back." She stood in the winter morning light and looked at him and at the ring and then back at him, and he saw her eyes brighten with a brightness that she made no effort to contain, which was the most unguarded he had ever seen her, and it was the finest thing he had ever seen in 32 years of paying attention. "Yes," she said. "Homer Wells, yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it, and then looked at him, and he kissed her there at the eastern fence line of the Hutchins ranch, where the survey marker still stood in the hard ground, and the whole of the New Mexico territory extended around them in its vast and beautiful indifference, and neither of them needed it to be anything but what it was. They married in March of 1884 in the Calico Flats church, which was a small adobe building that held about 60 people comfortably and about 90 on the day of their wedding, because Calico Flats had a particular fondness for events that allowed everyone to form an opinion together. Gerald Hutchins gave a toast that was 6 words long and completely sincere. Mrs. Patel, who had apparently developed strong feelings about the entire situation over the months of Homer's tenancy, cried openly and then pretended she had something in her eye. Tom Eves of the geological beard attended and brought a gift of exceptional practicality, which was a set of new survey stakes. Margaret wore a dress the color of warm cream that she had made herself over the winter evenings, with a careful attention to detail that Homer recognized as the same attention she gave to her measurement work, because to Margaret Archer, if something was worth doing, it was worth doing exactly right. She had a small bunch of wildflowers that bloomed early in the canyon, purple and yellow against the white dress, and she walked toward him down the church aisle with the directness she walked toward everything, and Homer stood at the front of the church and watched her come, and felt something so complete and so undefended in himself that he was briefly and purely amazed at it. He had spent 10 years building walls. She had spent 7 years building walls. What they had built together, piece by careful piece over these months, was something that the walls had been keeping out, and it was better than anything he had guarded against it could have been. They exchanged vows that were simple and honest without flourish, because both of them found honesty more meaningful than poetry, and then they were married, and the church held 60 people and the sound of them cheering. Spring came, and with it the Northern Boundary Survey Commission, which Margaret undertook with her characteristic thoroughness, while Homer managed the spring calving season, which was demanding and required 18-hour days and a close attention to 62 hands and 800 cattle. They came home to each other in the evenings tired and satisfied, and ate supper together and talked about their respective days, and Homer found in this domestic rhythm something he had no prior framework for understanding, a kind of daily contentment that was not excitement, not passion in the dramatic sense, but something more durable than either: the pleasure of genuine company, the comfort of someone who knew your particular shape and fit alongside it. The Northern Survey revealed no boundary irregularities, which Hutchins received with visible relief. Margaret's reputation in the territory continued to grow. In April, she received a commission from a mining operation near Silver City which would take her south for 3 weeks, and she told Homer about it across the supper table on a Tuesday evening. 3 weeks, he said. I know, she said. I have not been away from, she paused. I have not been away from a home in 7 years because I did not have one. He reached across the table. Go do the survey, he said. Do it well, come back. I will come back, she said, with a certainty in her voice that was both answer to his unspoken concern and declaration, the way she sometimes made declarations quietly and without fanfare that carried more weight than other people's formal proclamations. She went south to Silver City. He managed the spring operation, which was the most complex stretch of the year and left no room for being idle and sorry for yourself. He wrote her a letter on the 3rd day, which surprised him, because he had not been a letter-writing person previously. It was not a long letter. It told her about a calf born with a white star on its forehead that he had named Survey, in her honor, which he then noted immediately was probably too sentimental, and she should disregard if so. He sent it with the southbound mail rider and went back to work. She wrote back in the 2nd week. Her letter was longer than his and was mostly about the Silver City survey, with careful notations about the terrain and the geology that he found genuinely interesting, and at the end she said, "Tell survey that accurate field work begins with proper baseline establishment, and I expect nothing less from her." She signed it, "Your wife, Margaret Archer Wells." He read the name she had written 3 times. She came home on a bright May morning and rode through the ranch gate on Bay, who had become her horse over the winter months in an informal arrangement that nobody had officially declared, but everyone acknowledged, with her hat pushed back and her field equipment tied to the saddle, and her face alive with the particular satisfaction of someone who has done good work. And Homer came out of the stable to meet her, and she slid down from the horse and into his arms in a way that was neither dramatic nor planned, simply the natural gravity of 2 things that belong together finding each other. "The survey went well," he said into her hair. "Perfect measurements," she said. "No disputes. Clean boundaries." "Good," he said. "I missed you," she said, which he knew had cost her something to say, because Margaret did not offer vulnerability cheaply, and he understood and respected that it was a gift. "I missed you," he said, which was the simple truth, stated without qualification, because he had spent the past 10 years pretending things like that had no value and had run out of reasons to keep pretending. Summer moved through the territory in its relentless heat, and life at the ranch found a full and satisfying rhythm. Homer hired on 2 new hands to replace men who had left, both careful hires based on character assessments he had refined over years of judging people quickly and well. Margaret took 2 more survey commissions that summer, one near Albuquerque and one closer to home along the Rio Grande Basin, and in between she managed her office and her books with the same precision she brought to field work. In the evenings they sat on the porch of the small house that Hutchins had provided for the foreman's use, a solid adobe with a covered porch facing west, where the sunsets were extraordinary and Homer drank coffee and Margaret read or sketched maps, and the land went through its long evening changes from gold to orange to red to purple, and then the infinite dark spangled with more stars than most people ever took the time to count. They talked. They sat in good silence. They argued occasionally about things worth arguing about, and settled those arguments cleanly, and moved on. He built her a proper drafting table for the spare room she had converted into a home office, built it himself from timber he selected carefully, because he was good with his hands and took satisfaction in building things that would last. She organized his account keeping for the ranch operation, which had been functional but not optimal, and produced a system of records that was so clear and comprehensive that Hutchins called it the best ranch documentation he had seen in 40 years of cattle operations. They were useful to each other, and they were more than useful to each other, and both were important. In August, Margaret told him she was expecting a child. She told him across the breakfast table on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in the same direct way she told him everything, looking at him steadily over her coffee cup with those dark eyes carrying something complex hope and fear, and a love that was deep enough that it had weight you could feel in the room. He set down his own coffee cup and looked at her and felt something so large that it required a moment of complete stillness to contain. "Are you?" he began. "Yes," she said. "I know what it is. I have known for 3 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I said it." He got up from his chair and came around the table, and she stood to meet him, and he held her, not urgently, not dramatically, but with a kind of thorough and encompassing gentleness that was its own kind of eloquence. He could feel her breathing against his chest, steady and measured, the way she was always steady and measured, and beneath that steadiness he could feel the fine tremor of someone who is feeling too much to hold entirely still. "Margaret," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I know." "We lost," he started, because he had to acknowledge it, because she had told him about her daughter and about Thomas, and he would not pretend that history wasn't real. "I know what we might lose," she said. "I have thought about it, I am afraid of it," a pause, "but I am not going to let the fear of what might go wrong keep me from what is here right now." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "We will take care," he said. "Mrs. Trujillo in town is a good midwife. Hutchins's wife will know others." "I know," she said. She lifted her face to look at him. "I am not fragile, Homer." "I know you're not," he said, "but I intend to be careful anyway." She allowed this, which was its own form of trust. The pregnancy proceeded through the fall with the good health and quiet determination that characterized everything Margaret did. She slowed her field work in the later months, not because Homer asked her to, but because she made the practical assessment herself that certain terrain was no longer reasonable to navigate on horseback at an advanced state of pregnancy, and Margaret Archer Wells never sacrificed practicality to pride. She continued her office work and her calculations, and the house filled with the quiet domestic warmth of two people preparing, carefully and with great attention, for the person who was coming. Homer built a cradle from mesquite wood, which was the hardest and most durable wood available in the territory, because if he was going to build something, he was going to build it to last. He worked on it in the evenings while Margaret sat nearby with her surveying manuals or her letters, and she looked up sometimes and watched him work and had an expression that he caught occasionally, when she thought he wasn't looking, an expression so openly and vulnerably happy that it stopped him every time, because it was the Margaret that the professional composure usually kept tucked away, and it was, every time, the most important thing in his world. Their son was born in January of 1885, on a cold, clear night with the stars blazing overhead and Mrs. Trujillo moving quietly and competently through the bedroom, while Homer sat in the front room and heard the sounds from behind the closed door and did not move, did not speak, did not breathe as fully as usual, because he was engaged in the most focused act of paying attention of his entire life. When Mrs. Trujillo opened the door and said, "Come in, Mr. Wells, you have a son," he moved through the doorway and found Margaret propped against the pillows looking exhausted and entirely undimmed, holding a small and determined-looking person who had arrived in the world with evident opinions about the experience. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red-faced and loud about it, and felt something that did not have a name in any language he knew but which occupied the entire available interior space. "He is whole?" Homer asked. "Healthy. He is perfect," Mrs. Trujillo said from the doorway. "Strong lungs, good size, he'll be trouble." "He will be well looked after," Homer said. He looked at Margaret. She was looking at him with those dark eyes, tired and radiant and utterly herself, and she said, "Hello, Homer Wells." "Hello, Margaret Archer Wells," he said. "We need to name him," she said. "What do you want to call him?" She looked at the baby for a moment, then back at Homer. "Thomas," she said, and then quickly, "if you don't mind, for Thomas. The first husband, the first life, the man she had loved who had died young and left his name embedded in her history." Homer did not mind. He understood that love was not a competition with the past. "Thomas Wells," he said. "It is a good name." "Thomas James Wells," she said. "James was your father's name." He had mentioned his father once in passing months ago. That she had held on to it and brought it forward now told him something that he sat with for a long moment in the warm quiet of the room. "Thomas James Wells," he said. Thomas James Wells grew into an energetic and inquisitive toddler who had his mother's brown eyes and his father's jaw, and a personality that was entirely its own, loud, where both parents were quiet, enthusiastic where both parents were measured, and possessed of a determination to touch, examine, and if possible disassemble every object within reach. He was a source of daily astonishment to both of them, and they parented him with the same practical thoroughness they brought to their respective professions, which suited him well because he required a lot of management. Margaret returned to field work when Thomas was 6 months old, with arrangements made through Mrs. Patel's niece, a capable young woman named Lucia who came 3 days a week when Margaret was in the field. This was Margaret's choice, made on her own terms, and Homer supported it without reservation because he understood that her work was not a hobby or a supplement but a fundamental part of who she was, and to diminish it would be to diminish her, and he had no interest in a diminished version of Margaret Archer Wells. The survey business grew. In 1885 and 1886, Margaret's reputation in the territory expanded through a combination of professional excellence and the social network of the Calico Flats Land Association, through which Gerald Hutchins had quietly and effectively made it known that the survey of his eastern boundary had been conducted with exemplary accuracy. She took on larger commissions, hired a rod man to assist with field measurements, and began receiving correspondence from the General Land Office in Washington regarding a potential federal survey commission in the Northern Territories. Homer managed the Hutchins operation with the steady authority of a man who has found his place and intends to keep it. Under his management, the ranch expanded its cattle operation, resolved the boundary issue cleanly and permanently, and developed a water rights arrangement with a neighboring operation that benefited both properties. The 62 hands under his management turned over gradually, the less reliable men replaced with men who, like Homer, were there for the work rather than the situation, and the culture of the operation reflected this. They had their arguments, because they were both strong-minded people, and arguments were sometimes unavoidable. There was a period in the spring of 1886 when Margaret was considering taking the federal commission, which would require her to travel extensively for up to 6 months, and this led to several evenings of genuine and serious conversation about what their life was, and what they wanted it to be, and whose ambitions had priority. They did not resolve it quickly, and they did not resolve it easily, and there were 2 evenings when the conversation ended without resolution, and they went to bed with the difficulty still between them, which neither of them was comfortable with. On the 3rd evening Homer said, "Take the commission." She looked at him across the table. "What about Thomas?" "Thomas has Mrs. Patel's niece and a father who is not going anywhere," he said, "and there will be stretches where you can send for us, where we can come to you. You would do that, bring Thomas to the field. Thomas is 4 years old and already trying to ride every horse in the stable," Homer said. "The field will do him nothing but good." She looked at him for a long time. 6 months is a long time," she said. "It is," he said. "But you have worked your whole career toward this kind of commission, and I would be a poor kind of man if I let my own discomfort stand between you and it." "Homer," she said, and her voice was full of something that she sometimes had difficulty expressing directly and sometimes expressed most eloquently in these single-word statements that were his name said in a particular way. "Margaret," he said in the same way. She took the commission. Homer was honest with himself about the difficulty of the months she was away, about the long evenings with Thomas asleep, and the house quiet in a way that was different from the quiet he had known before her, because now the quiet had her absence in it rather than being simply empty. He wrote to her every week. She wrote back with maps enclosed and descriptions of the land she was surveying and occasional notes for Thomas that he read aloud at the supper table. And Thomas listened with great seriousness, and then asked when Mama was coming home, and Homer gave him an honest and specific answer, because both of them had raised this child on the understanding that honest and specific answers were the right ones. She came home in November, carrying her field equipment and 6 months of collected survey data, and a look of such complete and satisfied competence that Homer, seeing her ride through the ranch gate in the gray autumn afternoon, felt a surge of pride so thorough that it had no place to go but out through his face, which was not something he usually permitted, but on this occasion could not prevent. Thomas, who was 4½ and had been running toward the gate since mid-morning, based on a personal conviction that this was the day Mama would arrive, reached her first. She came off Bay's back before the horse had fully stopped, which was not best practice but was understandable under the circumstances, and scooped Thomas up and held him with her face buried in his hair, and he held her back with a 4-year-old's fierce and uncomplicated grip. Homer reached them and she looked up at him over Thomas's head with everything in her eyes, all of it, The whole unguarded truth of Margaret Archer Wells, who had spent years building walls and had, eventually, found something worth opening the gates for. He kissed her on the forehead and held them both. "Good survey," he said against her hair. "Perfect measurements," she said, muffled by Thomas. "Of course," he said. The Federal Commission, when published, was noted in the Territorial Gazette and subsequently in papers as far as Denver as the most accurate and comprehensive survey of the northern boundary districts conducted in 20 years. Margaret Archer Wells's name was attached to it in the official record, which was the official record of the General Land Office of the United States of America, and would remain accurate and lasting in the way that she had always done her work. Homer read the notice in the Territorial Gazette and showed it to her across the breakfast table. She read it with that particular stillness she had when something mattered more than she intended to show, and then she looked up and found him watching her, and she said, "Stop looking so pleased." "I am pleased," he said. "You look insufferable," she said. "I am insufferable," he said. "I am also right. I have always been right about you." "You have not always been right about anything," she said, with great professional certainty, and he laughed, which was something she had taught him to do again over the past years, to laugh at things worth laughing at, fully and without reservation. In 1887, their daughter arrived. Homer had made no predictions about gender and had no preferences, having learned from Thomas that the person who arrived was always entirely their own and could not be predicted in advance. But when Mrs. Trujillo placed the baby in his arms in the small hours of a September morning, and he looked down at her quiet and alert, and regarding him with a thoughtful expression that he found remarkably familiar, he felt that same enormous unnamed thing that he had felt on the night Thomas arrived. "Clara," Margaret said from the bed, watching him hold the baby. "Clara," he agreed. "Clara Ruth Wells," she said. "Ruth was your mother's name." He looked at her. "You told me once," she said. "In the canyon that first day. You said her name was Ruth." He had said it once. She had held it for years, carrying it forward to this exact moment to give him this. He stood in the lamplight with his daughter in his arms, and his wife watching him from the bed with those dark, unsparing eyes full of everything that had brought them here. And he was, in the fullest sense, undone by it, by the completeness of her, by the extraordinary thing she had done to his careful self-sufficiency, by the life that had accumulated around them in the years since a dusty afternoon at an eastern fence line in the New Mexico territory. "Clara Ruth Wells," he said carefully, as though the name itself was something to be carried with precision. "Yes," Margaret said. "Thomas arrived in the New Mexico territory spring of 1888 as a 5-year-old with the confident bearing of someone who had been the center of two focused and capable adults' attention for his entire life, and found this satisfactory. He attended the school that had been established in Calico Flats by a teacher from Ohio named Miss Hartwell, who recognized in him a particular combination of intelligence and stubbornness that required a firm and patient hand, which she provided admirably. He was, his teacher noted in her first report, one of the most curious children she had taught, and curiosity properly directed was the best foundation for learning she knew. Homer read this report and looked at Margaret across the table, and they exchanged the look of two people who have produced something they are privately very proud of and are maintaining dignity about. "He gets the curiosity from you," Homer said. "He gets the stubbornness from you," Margaret said. Clara at 2 was quieter than Thomas, but watching everything with those familiar dark eyes and already demonstrating a preference for her father's company that Homer found deeply affecting and Margaret found entirely amusing. "She has your expression," Margaret told him. "That look you do when you are assessing something." "I do not do a look," Homer said. "You absolutely do a look," Margaret said. "And she does it constantly. I see it on her every morning. It is remarkable." He looked at Clara, who was in fact at that moment regarding her toy horse with an expression of critical evaluation. "That is just a face," he said. "It is your face," Margaret said. "And I find it entirely endearing on both of you." Calico Flats in 1888 was a growing place, not large but settled, with the quality of permanence that some western towns developed and others never did. The railroad had been discussed and was being actively pursued by the Calico Flats Land Association, which Gerald Hutchins chaired, and in whose meetings Homer now represented the ranch operation with the authority of a man who had become a fixture of the community's practical functioning. The injustice of the land situation that Margaret's survey had uncovered, the fact that Hutchins had benefited for 12 years from public land he had not paid for, had been addressed through the purchase agreement, and this set a precedent for several other boundary resurveys in the area that followed, each handled with the same professional rigor that Margaret brought to everything. There were still difficulties, as there were difficulties in every Western territory. The water rights arguments that were the permanent background noise of life in the dry country continued. There were 2 years of hard drought in the late 1880s that stressed the cattle operation and required Homer to make decisions about herd reduction that were economically sound but personally hard, because he took the health of the operation personally in the way that people do when they have given something their full attention for years, and it has become genuinely theirs. Through the drought years, the ranch survived better than most because Homer had established water arrangements in the good years that held in the dry ones, and because he had managed the herd size conservatively, and because Margaret had surveyed every water source on and adjacent to the property, with a thoroughness that had produced a water map so complete and accurate that Homer could manage the cattle movement around water availability with a precision that smaller and less documented operations could not match. "That map you made in the first year," he told her one dry summer evening on the porch, watching the cattle at the far water tank. "It has saved this operation 3 times in 2 years." She looked at him. "You are giving me credit for practical necessity." "I am giving you credit for seeing the whole picture," he said. "That is what you do. You look at things and you see the whole picture, not just the part that is immediately in front of you." She was quiet for a moment. "That is perhaps the finest professional compliment I have ever received," she said. "It is not entirely professional," he said. She took his hand on the porch railing, and they watched the evening come down over the red country, and the cattle moved slowly against the fading light, and Thomas's voice came from inside the house where he was arguing with Clara about something that involved both of them being very certain they were right, which was so completely predictable as to be almost reassuring. "Homer," she said. "Margaret," he said. "I want you to know something," she said. "Tell me." She was quiet for another moment, and he waited because she never said important things quickly. "When I came to Calico Flats," she said, "I had decided very firmly that I did not need anyone, that I was complete without anyone, that the work was enough and moving was enough and the independence was enough." A pause. "I was so sure of it." "So was I," he said. "And I want you to know," she continued, "that being wrong has been the best thing that has ever happened to me." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were entirely open, entirely unguarded, everything she was present in them. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. You and Thomas and Clara, this life, this specific life." Homer Wells, who had spent 10 years proving he needed nobody, who had built the most thorough and successful fortress of self-sufficiency in the New Mexico territory, and who had watched that fortress come down, piece by careful piece, under the patient and unintentional assault of one Margaret Archer and her survey equipment and her dark, direct eyes, put his arm around his wife on the porch of their home and held her close in the quiet New Mexico evening. "I spent 10 years being very certain I was right about something," he said, "and every day since has been the evidence that I was wrong. I am grateful for being wrong." She leaned into him, which was not something Margaret did lightly or often, and so was, each time, a kind of gift. The years moved forward in the way of good years, not without difficulty, but with the quality of a life that is genuinely lived rather than merely survived. Thomas grew into a boy who was increasingly his own person, the curiosity becoming a specific and focused interest in mathematics, which his mother recognized and cultivated with great attentiveness. Clara grew into a girl who had her father's watchful patience and her mother's precision, and who, by the age of 4, could name every horse in the Hutchins stable and describe each one's particular character with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention since before she could talk. Gerald Hutchins retired from active management of the ranch in 1890 at the age of 67 and sold the operation in a transaction that included a provision for Homer Wells to continue as foreman under the new ownership, which was a family named Cortez from Albuquerque who were expanding their cattle interests northward. Homer negotiated this transition with his customary thoroughness, securing terms that protected the hands who had been with the operation for years, and establishing a clear understanding with the Cortez family about the management philosophy that had made the operation what it was. Margaret, by 1890, had a survey practice that employed 2 full-time rod men and a clerk, and had produced survey records for more than a quarter of the active land claims in the central New Mexico territory. She had been formally recognized by the General Land Office as one of the most accurate survey practitioners in the Southwest region, which had been noted in a letter that arrived from Washington and which she read at the breakfast table and then folded and put in her desk drawer without ceremony. "Washington wrote you a letter," Homer said. "I know," she said. "You are going to put it in a drawer." "It is a letter," she said. "The surveying was the work. The letter is just the letter." He thought about this and decided it was exactly correct and entirely characteristic, and that he would not have changed a single thing about her. In the spring of 1891, Thomas James Wells was 7 years old and could already do arithmetic in his head at a speed that made his teacher in Calico Flats send a note home, recommending that his parents consider the possibilities of his education beyond the local school. Clara Ruth Wells was 4 years old and had, the previous autumn, convinced her father to let her ride Amos on a lead rope around the stable yard, which she had done with an expression of complete satisfaction that Homer had stored in his memory as one of the finest images of his adult life. On a Sunday afternoon in May of 1891, Homer and Margaret sat on the porch of the foreman's house at the Cortez Ranch, which was the same house they had lived in for years. The house Homer had filled with furniture built by his own hands, and Margaret had filled with maps and survey instruments and books, and the accumulated evidence of a life fully occupied. The children were inside, Thomas arguing some mathematical principle with a patience that clearly came from his mother, and a conviction that clearly came from his father, and Clara listening to both sides with the watching expression that was so entirely her own. The land spread out to the west in the late afternoon light, and the sky above it was that extraordinary New Mexico blue that Homer had first ridden under in the autumn of 1883, when he had come to this country with nothing but his professional reputation and his carefully maintained independence. He thought about that man, the 32-year-old Homer Wells, who had walked into the Gold Dust Saloon and seen a notice on the wall and thought nothing of it, who had spent 10 years in the determined and genuinely believed project of proving that he could get along without anyone, and had been, in the end, wrong about it in the most complete and most fortunate way possible. He thought about the eastern fence line and the transit level on its tripod, and the woman who had turned around and said that the Hutchins hand could either state his business or go back the way he came, without a single sign of concern at having a stranger on a horse behind her. He thought about the Red Rock Canyon and the stars overhead and the December fire in Santa Fe and the January morning when he had held his son for the first time and understood with his whole body and heart what it meant to be bound to something. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret said beside him. "The eastern fence line," he said. She looked at him. "Specifically, the first day," he said. "You were looking through your eyepiece and you knew I was there before you turned around." "Of course I knew," she said. "I could hear Amos. And you told me to state my business or go back the way I came." "You might have been anyone," she said, but there was something in her voice that was quiet and warm, the tone she had when she was remembering something she held carefully. I might have been anyone, he agreed, and you would have managed perfectly well if I had been. Yes, she said. And yet, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she had done increasingly in the years of their marriage, and which he never took for granted. His arm went around her with the ease of 10,000 repetitions. I was complete before you, she said. I want you to know that I was managing, I was whole. I know, he said, I was too. But this is better, she said. Yes, he said. Margaret Archer Wells, this is considerably better. The sun moved toward the mesa, and the light turned gold, and somewhere inside the house, Thomas said something triumphant that caused Clara to say something equally triumphant in response, and both of them came out onto the porch to present their respective positions to their parents, both talking at once with the earnest energy of children who have not yet learned that adults sometimes want quiet, which was fine. Because Homer Wells and Margaret Archer Wells were people who valued honest and substantive communication at any volume level, even when it was simultaneous. Homer listened to Thomas's case and found it mathematically sound and told him so. Margaret listened to Clara's case and found it logically well-structured for a 4-year-old and told her so. Thomas and Clara looked at each other with the complex relationship of children who are each other's most constant companion and most reliable adversary. You are both right, Margaret told them, which was also characteristic, because she was a woman who preferred finding the accurate answer to winning the argument. Homer looked at his family on the porch in the western light, and at the country around them, and at the life that had accumulated from an afternoon at a fence line and a thunderstorm under a red rock overhang, and two people who had both arrived at the same place independently, and found, unexpectedly, that independence was not diminished by being shared, but was instead completed by it. He had needed nobody for 10 years, and he had been good at it, and he was grateful now to be bad at it. He had ridden into Calico Flats alone on a sorrel horse in the autumn of 1883, certain of who he was and what he required, which was very little from any other person. He sat on the porch of his home in the New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1891, with his wife's head on his shoulder, and his sons running commentary on mathematics, and his daughter's watchful dark eyes taking in the world with the thoroughness she had inherited from both parents. And he was, in every full and genuine sense of the word, home. The mesa held the last of the sunlight for another long minute, painting the world in shades of orange and red and deep gold, and then the light moved on, as light does, as everything in this country does, moving always, through the beautiful and indifferent world that asks nothing of you and gives everything to those who have the patience and the sense to be present for it. Margaret lifted her face and kissed him once simply in the evening air. "Come inside," she said. "Supper." He stood and followed her inside, into the warm lamplight where Thomas was already at the table with his numbers, and Clara was pulling at her chair with the purposeful expression of someone who has decided that supper will begin now. And the door closed behind him on the long New Mexico dusk, and he was, completely and without reservation, exactly where he needed to be.